Hey guys, we are here with for our next session. We have the team from Truffle, Kevin and Adrian, and they'll be doing a talk
Hello.
around decentralized, around building DeFi with Truffle. And I'll let them take it from here.
So yeah, hi guys, I'm Adrian, and I am Director of Front-End Engineering and Community here at Truffle. Later on in this talk, I'll be demonstrating forking for MAINNET and working with existing protocols. But for now, I'm going to hand it off to Kevin.
Hello, hey. I actually just saw karate. Someone I know from a previous course that I've taught through Truffle in there. So, but hopefully, yeah, you guys can hear me or both of us and see us. And also Eman as well. Hey guys. So yeah, this is a session, as Adrian mentioned, on Sinju called Building DeFi with the Truffle Suite. And next slide. So Adrian's going to be driving the slides, so I'll kind of be saying next slide throughout. But yeah, so in terms of agenda for the session, we'll just give our bios in a moment. Adrian kind of gave his, I'll give mine. Talk through the goals of the session, what we're going to try and achieve by the end. And given there's obviously two of us here today, we'll be splitting this session into two parts. So the first is going to be pretty high level by design on what the Truffle suite is. Specifically, we'll be looking, kind of exploring the various tools in the suite, and also touching on what's new. And that's really for folks that have heard of Truffle maybe, or used it a little bit. Perhaps it was a while ago. But yeah, just to kind of, and/or a refresher if it's been a while, if you've kind of actively used Truffle in the past. And then second half is going to be a kind of deep dive, and at that point I'll hand over to Adrian, where we're going to be exploring a new box, a Truffle box. And if you don't know what those are, I'll unpack that in a moment. But specifically, it's a DeFi box. And within that, we'll show a few pretty cool techniques or things. One is forking, using GANACHE forking, where you can actually fork state from mainnet and kind of interact with it. Oh, by the way, let me minimize my video. Sorry, I was told to do that and I forgot. There we go. So full screen on the slides. And also look how we can actually interact with existing on-chain protocols, essentially contracts that have already been deployed. And so yeah, we'll kind of unpack that and show you how you can do that. So it's pretty cool. And then we'll close out with kind of next steps if any of this is interesting and you want to kind of take it a little further, and obviously Q&A. And feel free to throw questions in the Q&A as we go through, and we'll kind of either answer in real time if it makes sense to, or we'll wait until the end. Okay, next slide, Adrian. Cool. All right, so brief bios. Yeah, as mentioned, my name's Kevin Bluer, and our titles are pretty amorphous at Truffle, but I'm the head of curriculum development and training. So really that manifests as running courses, and I noticed a few folks say hi in the chat, which is great. And also we do, corporate training, with companies that are kind of looking to upskill in-house teams or, hire folks and so on. And Adrian, do you want to mention a couple of more words on yourself? I know you kind of briefly introduced yourself at the start.
Yeah, sure. Well, I do a lot of the front-end stuff with in the DeFi space as well, community outreach. I do some speaking at some conferences, kind of just approaching things from the JavaScript traditional Web 2 developer point of view, and how to make things a little bit easier for that kind of crowd, to get more adoption for Ethereum and the wider blockchain community. So that's kind of been my personal passion for the past couple of years. Yep.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah.
Next slide. Cool. Okay, so as mentioned, I won't dwell on this, but goal of the session, or goals, is really to have something for everyone. We've put in a ubiquitous meme here of covering all the bases. Really, that's just going to manifest as some basics, some high-level stuff on what Truffle is. So already know all that. Kind of just be a little bit patient if you don't mind. Where in the second half we'll be kind of diving into a bit more kind of intermediate to advanced stuff. So that's the goal. Okay, so yeah, starting with just a high-level overview of Truffle for those that are kind of new to it, heard of it, perhaps not touched it in too much depth. So yeah, really what Truffle is a suite of tools. Our kind of slogan or catchphrase is to get developers from an idea for a decentralized app to the realization of that decentralized app as comfortably as possible. What that looks like in terms of the tool suite is a range of different tools, components, and utilities to aid kind of in the whole life cycle of the building of a decentralized app. Everything from Truffle as the CLI tool. It gets a little confusing because Truffle Suite sounds like just Truffle, but we actually have a bunch of tools in there. So over the CLI, which we'll talk about in a moment, something called GANACHE, formerly Test RPC, which is a personal blockchain. Again, we'll kind of unpack that a little bit. DRIZZLE, a front-end framework, and the newest tool in the suite is something called Truffle Teams. In terms of usage, we have, I think it's actually a fair bit over this now, but 5 million plus downloads across all the tools in the suite. And I put 100% open source here. Technically, that's accurate, and all our kind of main tools are open source, and that's the kind of major philosophy of the company. The only kind of caveat to that is Teams, because it's a SaaS product, so elements of it are open source, and a few some of it's a little is closed. But yeah, most things you can just assume are open source where it makes sense to be open source. And yeah, URL for our GitHub org is github.com/trufflesuite. And yeah, who's using Truffle? So yeah, it's been around a while, and if you've done kind of anything in this space, there's a reasonable chance you may have used it. And yeah, it spans everything from individual indie developers or young early stage projects that perhaps use Truffle in some capacity or using Truffle, right through to larger firms who in some cases maybe are new to the space as well, because obviously the whole space is relatively new. So obviously some big names up there as well. And we're pretty agnostic. We will try and work across the board, and where it makes strategic sense for us as an organization, and help furthering the mission and the paradigm and the philosophy and so on. So next slide. Okay, so what I'll do now is just briefly go through the tools for a few moments, just to give you a flavor. And again, just to kind of caveat, this is if you are new to Truffle or new to any of the tools in the suite. But yeah, first up is the CLI. So this was actually the first tool. The genesis of this was actually Tim, who's our founder, Tim Coulter. When Ethereum was in way back at the start of its kind of development, there were tools, but they were pretty disjointed. So it really started as a kind of group of collection of scripts to kind of make that development experience a bit more cohesive and smoother. And that's what grew in what kind of where Truffle grew from. So it still is a kind of morphed into a more fully fledged command line tool. As mentioned, it covers the kind of full development lifecycle. In the case of Truffle CLI, it's really around the contract development itself. We're a version 5, so it's pretty mature as a tool, and is very actively maintained. And we have a weekly release cadence, and we're I think 64 weeks in a row where we've had a release. Some of them obviously a bit more smaller, bug fixes, etc. Others a bit more fully fledged. And just a few features of the CLI, essentially commands that you would use. And the init would fire up a bare bones project. There's also a kind of sister command of that called unbox, and we'll talk about that one in a moment, which is this library of boxes that we have. Compile, which essentially generates all the assets based on your source code, or there will be I say assets or artifacts. Tests, so you can we have a fully pretty robust testing suite built into the tool, so you can run your tests, debug, to step through and kind of lift the lid on what's going on within your contracts, and then migration. So if you're ready to deploy to either a locally and or a testnet, mainnet, or any kind of EVM compatible chain, the whole thing is baked in there. Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So yeah, boxes, as kind of mentioned. And the reason we kind of call this out is because Adrian's going to be specifically using a new box that we've created, in the context of DeFi. But what they are first, just to give you a heads up, if you've not heard of them before, essentially they're boilerplate projects, and they're really great for both learning. If you're kind of again new to the space, and you'll see if you go to trufflesuite.com/boxes, you can see there's kind of pretty wide array of boxes there, and they're also really good for kickstarting new projects. So you can use it as a kind of template essentially. And they kind of manifest as sample contracts, different front ends, frameworks, and then everything through to kind of a little bit more complete dApps that you could use again as a kind of boilerplate. They come in 3 flavors essentially. In the kind of middle of this slide, we have officially maintained ones. So if there's breaking changes in our tooling, we'll kind of update the box accordingly. Or in Solidity version bump that perhaps breaks something. Again we'll update the box to rectify it. We have partner boxes, you can see in the middle there, as an example, and then we have this kind of long tail of community boxes. So really anyone can submit a box, and we'll get it get pushed into the collection. And there's, in a similar vein to like Truffle and Init, which I alluded to a moment ago on the previous slide, to pull down a box and kind of unpack any dependencies and so on, you can just use Truffle unbox and then the name of the box, and it will do its thing. Okay, so next up, so that's Truffle as a tool and Truffle boxes. Next up is Ganache. Again, may have heard of it, may have used it. Ganache, again, formerly test RPC. So, if you've used Truffle a while ago, you might have seen test RPC, you might see it on like Stack Overflow and so on. Now it's called Ganache, or has been for a while. Really what it is a local blockchain that you can, or local Ethereum blockchain that's used for a dev test. Comes in two flavors. There's a UI version of it, which is great for if you're just getting started, because you get kind of more visual kind of cues of everything, for this of contract state, any events that are being emitted from your contracts, the tab for that. So it makes it a lot easier just to kind of orientate yourself. So definitely what we'd recommend if you're kind of new to development. And then we have a CLI version, and that's kind of baked into the Truffle CLI. If you can kind of instantiate a Ganache instance for you, and then you get a lot more kind of advanced kind of configuration options and so on, and like you can script it and so on. And then with Ganache, we're actually actively adding support for other chains as well. And if that's something you're interested in, I'd love to chat about that. And just a couple of screenshots there of the bottom of the two, although they're a bit hard to see. DRIZZLE, the third, if you like, tool in the suite, is a React library. Well, as I say, React is a library for build up. Come to the React part in a moment, but it's a UI library for building the interfaces to your decentralized app, built on top of Redux. And we have support for React, a bunch of components, and then more recently we've added Vue support as well. And what that does essentially handles, amongst other things, I should say, is the synchronization of your contract state or your data to a local Redux store. So just abstracts. It's not a huge library, but this does some of the heavy lifting in terms of synchronizing state to the Redux store and so on. Okay, I'm kind of moving rapidly just to make sure we've got time for the unboxing of our DeFi box. But the last tool in the suite is the newest one. And that's something called Truffle Teams. As mentioned or alluded to earlier, this is a SaaS product, and we'd love for folks to give it a try. It's pretty early on in the cycle, but we're already pretty happy with how it's progressing. But what Teams is a kind of to handle the whole like team-based workflow, development workflow, and not exclusively with Teams, although that's kind of one of the core use cases for it. But everything from associated with the life cycle of building blockchain app, and a few features that we have, or just to call out a few features, is Ganache sandboxes. So if you want it's kind of one-click spinning up a kind of hosted Ganache instance versus it running locally, and that's great for testing things out in a more team-based scenario, or getting perhaps some early users to kick the tires, similar to a testnet in that scenario, in that sense, but a lot other kind of characteristics there. Now the key core feature is the continuous or CI, continuous integration feature. We say zero config, so it kind of just works. It picks up your Truffle config, and we'll just continually run the tests in the background, spitting out the status of those tests. We have the visual deployment feature, so you can kind of just, rather than having to kind of do slightly more arcane configuration within your Truffle config, you can do it visually to deploy from the current up to test nets, mainnet, and so on. And then contract monitoring as well. As once your contracts have gone live, on any visible network, test or main, you can monitor kind of the health of those, in terms of transaction successes, failures, etc. So tons of different stuff, and it's evolving. And again, we'd love for folks to kick the tires on it, give us feedback, and so on. Okay, thanks. Next slide. So we're there. So getting started with some of this stuff. So this slide, and we'll kind of summarize this at the end as well. Again, next slide, Adrian. Thanks. So these are I've kind of pulled together, for those that are new to developing using Truffle, or or any of the things we've just talked about. The kind of three best places to start are as follows. So firstly, we have a number of tutorials for just kind of walking you through the process. Popular one called is it Truffle Pet Shop? I actually forget what it's called, but essentially centered around a pet shop. So if you go to trufflesuite.com/tutorials, you'll see them there. So the link to the boxes, as I mentioned, another great place to get started with is trufflesuite.com/boxes. And you can do it, filtering and see the different types of boxes that we have up there. And then the last one is Ganache UI, as mentioned. So, if you go to trufflesuite.com, you'll see two options for installing, the CLI version or the GUI-based version. If you just click that, then again, they're kind of much more easier to kind of guide you through the process for getting started. Okay, so with that, any questions, throw them in the chat. But with that, we'll shift from kind of high level, a little more beginner centric to the, across the spectrum to a bit more intermediate to advanced, I would guess, when we're actually going to dissect a box, but specifically it's a new DeFi box that we've just put together. So yeah, with that, I'll hand over to Adrian to do that. So over to you, Adrian.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. So I'm back, and we're going to get into slightly more technical details about how to work with DeFi, forking off of MAINNET. That's kind of been the thing that I've been looking into quite a bit, especially with, all these DeFi protocols coming out, and you want to create your own dApp that works with all of these protocols. One of the best ways to do it is to fork with GANACHE. And I'll get into that a bit more. So let's start thinking about the landscape that we have here, right? With the DeFi, there's so many, all these money Legos that everyone talks about, and it's great. It's amazing. You can get your flash loans from Aave. You can get them slightly cheaper from DYDX. And then sometimes maybe you want some coins. You want to get some ERC20 tokens, so you got to swap for them on Uniswap. But wait, there's like Uniswap V2, so should you do that instead? And guess what? Uniswap V2 also supports flash loans. So what the heck? It's getting a little bit crowded here, right? If you want to take out a position, maybe you want to go on Compan, or maybe you want to be on Maker. Now Maker is supporting all these different collateral types as well. And if you're really into bonding curves, maybe you want to interface with Curve Finance as well, right? But basically, the idea here is that we are working with a lot of different things, and you might want to create one particular dApp that interacts with multiple protocols, right? So how do you do that, right? Because it can get pretty confusing pretty fast. I mean, even just putting this slide together was quite a lot of work. So what are some of the needs of DeFi development, right? I kind of alluded to it a little bit in the previous slide, but one of the things is like making sure you grab ERC20 tokens, right? So a lot of times people would write their own ERC20 tokens and then basically launch it on their own local testnet. But then, what if you want to work with multiple ERC20 tokens? What if those tokens have some extensibility and that they interact with other protocols, right? It starts getting a little hairy quite quickly. If you're working with stuff like Uniswap or BZX, for example, you might want to have some kind of liquidity with some of these protocols that you're interacting with. Otherwise, you're going to try to get information from these protocols. And if you write mock contracts, you're going to make sure that they return realistic prices. So you're trying to simulate what real liquidity looks like. And of course, with flash loans, the way it works is that you have to trigger it somewhere, and then somehow the other flash loan, the flash loan kind of provider will call a callback in your contract, and there's like a lot of indirection there, and there's a callback dependent behavior. It just gets a little bit complicated, just a little bit. So at the end of the day, the point is you're trying to simulate the real world, right? And I'm sure Elon will be very excited to hear about this. But the fact of the matter is it's really difficult to simulate the real world, and it's just something that's not quite tenable, right? So what are some of the current approaches? I talked about this in the previous slide as well. People like to do a lot of mock contracts, right? But it can be a lot of work to create some of these mocks. And at the end of the day, they're not a good representation of what reality is. So, you might have a whole bunch of scripts about mock contracts, and they simulate what you think reality is. But what if the real world changes? How are you going to change your mock contracts every time something in the real world changes? It's a very fragile simulation. It's a fragile dev setup. And some people might even think about, okay, why don't I just deploy the entire MakerDAO system locally? I mean, that's a bit of an extreme example, but there's like you can do that for any number of protocols that are public and that you're able to deploy. But obviously that's like quite untenable, because that's a huge maintenance burden, huge upfront work, and you still have the issue of not having real liquidity. The other thing is some people like to use testnets because it gives you kind of like a real-ish environment, and some protocols are deployed on testnets as well. But I don't know any of you guys have ever used testnets, one of the most important, like most annoying things that you got to beg for test ether. You know, you go on Twitter, you tweet someone just to get, hey, can I get some test ether for Ropsten, for example, or you got to find a faucet. It's just a huge hassle. Like, I'm just trying to create a dApp. Why do I have to beg for these esoteric coins that don't really have much value? So and of course there are some protocols that only exist on certain testnets. Like one protocol might only exist on Ropsten, but then there's another protocol you also want to interact with, and that only exists on Rinkeby. Well, what are you going to do, right? Now you can't really test your contracts on one network. You got to have to mock them out depending on what network you're on. I mean, at that point you're almost, I mean, I'm exaggerating here, but you might as well just do things on mainnet, which is why I think that current approaches are a bad idea, and I think that there are better ideas. Like I said, we can just do it live, right? Because Ganache actually, since I believe 2016, 4 years ago, already had this ability to fork from mainnet. But unfortunately, I guess the word didn't really quite get out. But because now there's such a huge need for it with all these money Legos and people depending on each other's protocols, you know, I'm bringing it back, right? It's something that I got really excited about, and I started writing a lot of blog articles about it. I actually create a little bit of a small community where we just talk about, you know, DeFi development called studydefi.com, and we have a Discord and a Twitter. I'll get more to that later, but the whole idea is that we want to fork off mainnet because it allows us to have all of these benefits that we otherwise would not have. So what are these benefits, right? Number one, it's real and full liquidity. Like I was saying before, you know, all these numbers that you're gonna get as you pull from these networks, those are the real thing, right? Everything is also available on the same network. So, you know, and if it's not, then it's like you're not gonna be able to deploy those things onto mainnet anyway, right? So that might make it harder for people who want to work with protocols that are not on mainnet yet. But for the most part, throughout my experience talking to startups as well, there seems to be quite a bit of a demand for people who want to work with stuff that is on mainnet, because, you know, that's how you kind of leverage the benefits of having you know, the ability to build on other people's protocols. And of course, there's also no more begging for test ether. It's just like normal Ganache test chain. You can issue yourself like 1,000 ether if you want. It's quite easy, very simple. There's nothing to deploy. So basically, you spin this up and you have access to ENS, you have Compound, you have Maker, Uniswap, V1, V2, you know, everything that you really want, right? And most importantly, you get something called dev prod parity. And I'm not sure if how many of you guys you know, were developing back in the Web 2.0 days, and not that it's a long time ago, but you know, 12-factor apps was a huge thing. You know, one of the items in 12-factor apps, what makes a really good app is something that has, you know, dev prod parity. So your development environment and your production environment is extremely similar, if not exactly the same. And forking from mainnet gives us that ability, right? It takes away from the fragileness of having a lot of mock contracts in a simulated world. So these are all great things, and I think good job, Ganache, for existing even before I joined the Truffle. So great. So here we are. We want to announce our wonderful DeFi box. As Kevin mentioned, these are basically template projects. This one specifically to demonstrate how to fork from mainnet and swap coins on Uniswap. I'll get into a little bit more detail on that in a quick second. But if you want to try that right now, it's very simple. If you have Truffle installed, just type Truffle unbox DeFi in any empty folder. Or if you don't have Truffle installed, just prepend that with npx Truffle unbox DeFi. That'll automatically install Truffle and then unbox it. So, you know, you can always go to the GitHub, and we'll have links for this later as well. But, you know, as you can see, very simple to get started. And what this has, what this box demonstrates is that we're going to fork off mainnet, and we actually have a Jest testing framework that runs basically sandboxed Ganache instances that have access to mainnet state. And then I'll give you a bit more of a detailed diagram of that in 1 second. And one really important thing that we're going to demonstrate is that we're going to buy DAI with our ETH on Uniswap. So we're swapping ETH for DAI, basically. And then that's actually going to be run within a test that runs in parallel off of a sandboxed mainnet forked Ganache instance. That's quite a mouthful. But you know, it's a very simple thing, right? Like, you're buying DAI with ETH from Uniswap. But if you look into it and you really pick it apart, you're actually already interacting with more than one on-chain protocol. You you're actually interacting with the real DAI contract, deployed on the real DAI addresses, and you're also interacting with the Uniswap contract, and of course the liquidity that they have on chain. So the price that you get are actually realistic. So when you run the tests, you can actually see, oh, the price is actually I don't know, 100 something DAI for 1 ETH or something like that, depending on, this might not age well depending on what happens to the market. But yeah, and then so there's actually another side project of mine, with studydefi.com. A couple of us in the community actually got together to compile all these ABIs and addresses of these contracts, so that if you can just npm install money Legos and you can get access to these things very easy. And also includes the Solidity interfaces as well. So no more copy and pasting Solidity interfaces, no more copy and pasting ABIs and addresses. And this box will have all this in there as well to demonstrate to you how easy it is now in May 4th, 2020 to build on DeFi. Relatively speaking, I'm sure this is quite awkward a year from now. But so the structure of the box is the main I would say the main character, the star of the show, right, is forking from mainnet. So I'm just gonna talk about how that works, right? We have, in the beginning, we have the real world, mainnet, right? That goes way back to Genesis block. And from there, we actually fork into a local Ganache instance. So this is actually very similar to you creating your own local Ganache test chain, but it has a fork. It is created off of a fork of mainnet, so you actually get access to all that mainnet state. At which point we can have our own smart contract, and we migrate that to a local Ganache. Still very simple compared to traditional Truffle project. You create your own test chain, you create your own Solidity contract, you migrate to it, and usually from there you run your test and you're done. However, what we want to do now is something even more interesting, right? Because we're going to have all these different tests, right? So for example, index.test.js here on the left, what that does is it checks how much DAI you have initially, which should be 0 because we're coming with like a new account, and how much ETH you have, and which by default is 100. So that's all that checks, right? It's kind of like a smoke test. And then on the second part here, you can see uniswap.test.js. What that does is that it takes uses JavaScript and the ABIs and addresses of Uniswap's contract to swap DAI for ETH, ETH for DAI. Right, and it does all that, without interacting with any of my own contracts. And then finally, there's mydApp.test.js. That also swaps ETH for DAI, but it does that via the mydApp.sol. So you have three test suites here. They're testing completely different things, two of which actually can overlap with each other, because the Uniswap test and the mydApp test both are swapping Ether for DAI, right? So if you don't do this, what we're doing here, you can actually have state from one file affecting the state of another file. And the way we get around that is that for each of these test suites, we actually instantiate a Ganache instance in memory. And because Jest, the test runner, runs these things in parallel, it actually can complete much faster than if these things were done sequentially, right? And I have some numbers to show you in a quick second. But here's that's the crazy part, right? Like, we're actually forking from mainnet to have a local Ganache instance, and then within our tests, each of our test suites, we're actually instantiating another fork of that local Ganache, so that we get access to the mydApp.sol and access to the mainnet state. So that's really quite interesting, in my opinion. And of course, if you want to know more, we can have that discussion. This is what that test output looks like. As you can see, swapping Uniswap manually in the middle there, and you can swapping Uniswap via mydApp. Very, very, very simple. It even shows you the number of seconds it took. And a lot of these things are quite actually latency based because of how things are done. But I hope this just goes to show you how powerful this could be, right? And some people might think like, oh, you're spawning a whole Ganache instance for each test suite. Isn't that really memory consuming? And to that, I might say, yeah, it might be. But at the same time, how else are you going to test it at this point, right? I mean, in many ways, this is still a proof of concept, and maybe there could be a lot more optimizations that we can do. But I highly encourage you guys to take a look and really check out some of these things that we're playing around with at Truffle and also beyond in our community, right? So we have a bunch of links here for the next steps. And I don't know, Kevin, do you want to go through these?
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and paste them in to the chat here.
Sure.
Like just in a few chunks. But thanks, Adrian. That was awesome. And just to kind of wrap up before we get to Q&A, that was just to say you've got them if you Rod. I'm not quite sure what the status is with the slides being shared and so on, or decks being shared. But either way, I've just pasted the links into the chat. So next steps, as per Adrian's point, I've just kind of re-summarized the things. If you're new to Truffle and you want to play around, like some of the recommended things to get started with, I've pasted in the link to the README for to the GitHub repo more specifically, and that gives you steps for kind of unboxing and installing Truffle and so on if you haven't already got it. And then the last one was, our email addresses, our contact details. Right. So if you want to get in touch with us with any questions, and I guess just to call out Teams as well, because that is a new product for us that we very much welcome feedback on, and but really all of the above, that anything with the box or Truffle related. I see Nestor as well. What's up, Nestor? Feel free to get in touch anytime. And with that, in the last few minutes that we have, feel free to shout out any questions.
Let's take a look at these questions we have here. The first one is, can dApp previously deployed and launched be added to Truffle team, or do we need to start from fresh? I believe you can actually. It connects to your GitHub account, and then it just it has a pretty good onboarding process. So Jay Leon, I implore you to go and check it out. And of course, you can reach out to us if you want to try out Truffle teams and need a bit of help. Second question, when I fork from MAINNET, how do I get the ownership for an account with Ether? Is there a stub that fakes ownership? Yes, there is actually. So you can actually create your own account just by passing in like your own private key and giving yourself Ether. There's actually a configuration in Ganache for that, and that is actually demonstrated inside the DeFi box as well. If you want to fake yourself as owning a different account, you can also do that. That's something called unlocking accounts. That's an option under Ganache CLI and Ganache Core. So if you look at the GitHub for that as a documentation, just Control F, find the unlock accounts, and then you'll find a way to do that. And I think Emin here asks, what if I don't have Ether balance in MAINNET? As I said, you actually don't need your own Ether balance in MAINNET, because you can instantiate your own account and then give yourself like 1 million Ether if you want. So and again, that is demonstrated in DeFi box. So just take a look at the configuration in the DeFi box. There's not that many files. And of course, if you have any questions, reach out to me either personally on Twitter, or I'm always hanging out in the studydefi.com Discord, or anywhere really, or even just post an issue on the repo itself. That could help. Any other questions?
Otherwise, I can just chat with all these people I know from prior Truffle.
I think we have 1 minute left, so it might just.
I know we're right down to the wire. Oh gosh, I locked my table there.
I think we're pretty good. So just reach out, guys.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for listening, guys, and hope you've had a great conference. And thanks to Sinju for putting this on. And gosh, doing a marathon 4 straight days, right?
All right, cool. Well, thank you guys so much. This was a really great session. We're going to transition to our next one now.